Please be seated. I think we have Mr. Roberts. Would you please come forward, and would you mind stating your full name for the record, please?
Timothy Andrew Roberts.
Okay. Do you wish to affirm or swear an oath?
I, Timothy Andrew Roberts, sincerely declare and affirm that the evidence I give to this commission shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, Mr. Roberts. Yes.
Please the court, my name is Penglis with Ms. Butler. I appear on behalf today for Mr. Roberts, and I say that because I represent other interests in this commission. I'll make it clear on each morning who I'm here for.
Oh, I'm sorry, sit down, please, Mr. Roberts. Yes, thank you, Mr. Penglis.
Thank you. Mr. Roberts, you've prepared 2 witness statements for the purpose of these proceedings, correct?
I have.
Can I show you these 2 originals, may it please the Commission? Thank you. Can you look at the longer or the larger document, please, Mr. Roberts, first of all? It comprises 18 pages. Do you identify that as your first witness statement in these proceedings?
I do.
On the last page, is that your signature? And it's dated 26 July 2021, correct?
Correct.
Would you look at the second statement, which is 1 page? Is that the second or supplementary witness statement that you've made for the purpose of this hearing?
It is.
Is that your signature?
It is.
And it's dated 29 July 2021? Correct?
Yes.
All right, well, with those 2 statements read together, do you confirm that their contents to be true and correct?
I do.
Please, the Commission, I tender those statements.
Thank you. The 2 statements with the identifying numbers and dates TAR.0001.0001.0001 dated the 26th of July 2021 and TAR.0001.0001.0019 dated the 29th of July 2021 will be admitted as exhibits. Thank you, Mr. Penglis. Mr. Futrell.
May it please the Commission. Mr. Roberts, my name is Michael Futrell. I'm one of the counsel assisting this Commission. I'm saying that because the room does have a number of people in it. So I'm going to ask you a number of questions today. Just before I start, you received with your summons a letter from the solicitors assisting the Commission that contained a number of topics in a schedule. Do you recall that?
I do.
And the statement you've given is in response essentially to a series of questions that were set out in that schedule, correct?
Correct.
And is it the case that your statements, where they deal with those topics, effectively the evidence you wish to give to this Commission on those topics?
It is.
Now, what I intend to do largely today is to take you through the same topics and your answers to those questions, and ask you, in some instances where possible, to expand on the answers you've given, and also to clarify some of the matters to which you've given a response. And there may be some occasions when we depart a little bit from that material, but the gist of it is for you to provide this Commission with as much information as you are able to recall to assist it in its inquiry.
Understood.
Now, can I start at the beginning, as it were, with your appointment as a director of Burswood Limited? You were appointed a director in 2005 on your evidence after your brother Andrew Roberts resigned, correct?
Yes.
And can you remember, or can you tell the Commission, please, who approached you to become a director of Burswood Limited in 2005?
I can't recall who approached me other than that my brother had spoken to me about would I be interested in replacing him as a director, and that's all I can remember.
Okay, Mr. Roberts, you are speaking relatively quietly, which is no doubt your normal mode of speaking. But for the transcribers, you need to just make sure you speak up a little bit more,
Yes.
if you don't mind.
Sorry,
Okay.
Mr. Futrell, I also noticed that your microphone is your fault. Yes.
I see. Thank you, Commissioner Jenkins. Now, at the time that you joined the board of Burswood Limited, Mr. James Packer was the chair. Is that right?
Correct.
And do you recall whether you had any discussions with him as chair of the board of Burswood Limited prior to you becoming a director?
In respect of Burswood Limited?
Yes.
No.
Was Mr. Packer known to you as a personal acquaintance at the time you became a director?
Yes.
Would you describe yourself as one of his friends or a mere acquaintance?
A friend.
And it's the case, isn't it, that you, in fact, attended his wedding in 2006? Is that right?
Correct.
Now, is that one of the reasons you agreed to become a director of Burswood Limited, that you had a personal relationship with Mr. Packer?
No.
What was the reason that you agreed to become a director of Burswood Limited?
There were several reasons. One being that I was interested in the vision of what I understood from the shareholder in respect of the expansion of the facilities, and my sphere of expertise was around property development and construction. And the second, it was a very iconic facility, and I was interested in the business.
I see. So there are two aspects to that. One is you referred to the vision, I think, of the shareholder, and by that do you mean at that time PBL, Publishing Broadcasting Limited, as the ultimate owner of Burswood Limited, or someone else?
I recall PBL.
So when you're talking the vision of the shareholder, that's you're equating that with PBL, correct?
Correct.
And at that time, you were also a director or on the board of one of the flagships for the Multiplex group at that time.
I was a director of Multiplex Group.
And it was part of the vision of PBL to expand the footprint of the Perth casino at the time.
Correct.
And you could see a synergy, if you like, between your expertise in construction and the further development of the Perth casino.
Could you repeat your question, please?
You could see a synergy or a connection between your expertise in construction via your association with Multiplex and the possible expansion of the Burswood casino.
I'm unsure what you mean by a synergy in respect to those two matters.
Did you see an opportunity for Multiplex to become involved in the construction of any expansion of the Perth casino footprint?
If it did so, it would be done, as I understood, under normal process, which would require tendering and otherwise.
And your view of your own expertise was that you could assist, is it, Burswood Limited, by providing it with your understanding and expertise in construction?
Yes.
Now, could I ask you to draw your attention to some of the responses in your statement? So if you have your statement there, what I will do is take you to them and then ask you some questions about your response. So there's question 6. I don't know if Mr. Pengs has provided you with a copy of your statement with a long number in the top right-hand corner that starts TAR.
I provided the original.
If you look at the first page of your statement, I think it's on there, Mr. Pengs. In the top right-hand corner, there should be a long number starting TAR and it ends 0 with a 1.
Yes.
I'll refer to the page numbers. This is the last digit of that long number, so that I don't have to keep on saying the whole thing. So if you go to page 3 and your response to question 6, and I'll take you also over the page to your response to questions 7 and 8 as well. I'm going to summarise what I think the effect of your evidence is, and you feel free to disagree with me, but the nub of it is, in your statement you've said that at the time of your appointment as a director of Burswood Limited, you had no qualifications, expertise or experience specifically relating to casino operations. That's correct, yes. And in the balance of, in particular, if I draw your attention to question 6, you describe there the means by which information was provided to you whilst you were a director of Burswood Limited. And could I ask you, are you intending by that to provide some information to this commission suggesting that you gained, this is the means by which you gained, if you like, on the job expertise and experience in casino operations?
Yes.
In other words, the source of your information was by attending directors' meetings and being provided with information by the executives of the company.
Correct.
And then over the page, in your answer to question 7, you have indicated that you familiarised yourself at the time of your appointment with the regulatory, on my words, framework, and you considered the state agreement, and you attended a meeting with an employee whose name you can't recall, and you spent approximately half a day familiarising yourself with the operations of the business. Were there any other times when you had sessions with one-on-one, as it were, or with other directors where you were taken through in detail aspects of the operations as they changed over time?
Yes.
You haven't mentioned that here, but was that part of the way in which you were informed of the operations of the business?
Yes, there was many discussions outside the board meetings.
There were discussions outside board meetings?
Yes.
Okay, and who were those discussions with?
The executive management.
Okay. And I'll come back to who those people were. And were they pre-arranged sessions, or were they informal?
I cannot recall.
And were they with respect to specific activities to the best of your recollection, or were they of a more general nature?
My recollection was that we had discussions about the operations of the business and respect of compliance and other general matters of the company.
So I'm going to ask you to speak up again.
Sorry, I'll repeat. Could you repeat your question again?
Were the sessions you had with the executive, were they, for instance, if there was a specific initiative taking place at the Burswood Casino, were you given a briefing on that, or were they of a more general nature from time to time?
They were the general nature of the business, and I'll qualify that by saying that we discussed matters that were made up or discussed at the board, subsequently discussed at board meetings.
Okay, so just to be clear, we're referring here to meetings that took place outside the framework of the directors' meetings.
Correct.
Okay. Now, can I just take you back to one other matter, which I wanted to deal with, related to your experience at the time. Now, until 2007, you were one of the executive directors of Multiplex.
Correct.
And then I take it from 2007 on, you parted company and began, founded and were the chair of the Warburton Group.
Correct.
And you've mentioned in your statement that you have been, or ceased to be, the director of over 300 Australian companies.
Correct.
Are there additional companies of which you've been a director outside of Australia that you as well?
Correct.
And approximately how many of those companies have you been a director of?
I can't recall.
Okay, now in the period, focusing on the period from 2007 onwards, because I'm making an assumption that many of those companies may have been connected with your role in Multiplex. Approximately how many of those 300 did you sit on in the period between 2007 and 2019 when you ceased to be a director?
I can't recall.
Were you sitting on many companies concurrently with your position on Burswood Limited?
I can't recall how many companies that I sat on concurrently with Burswood at the time, between 2007 onwards.
Well, can you give the Commission some indication? Presumably it's not 300, but
No.
Is it 10s, 20s, or less?
It would be speculating, and I would be saying it would be over 10, but less than 20.
Okay. And of those, were any of them ASX listed companies?
Yes.
And you sat on the boards of how many of those?
One listed company,
And which company is that?
Mineral Resources Limited.
All right. And the others, were they private companies of your own or third parties?
Well, one was Burswood Limited,
Yes.
and the others were private companies.
And approximately how much of your time was taken up from month to month attending to the various companies of which you were then a director?
Substantial amount of time.
Would you regard it as having been effectively a full-time occupation?
Near full-time, yes.
And leaving aside Burswood Limited, how much of your time, if you like, was left after dealing with these other matters for you to attend to the affairs of Burswood Limited?
I still had ample time to attend to the needs of Burswood.
Okay. Now, returning to your answer to question 6, if I may. You've described there, if I can summarise the answer to question 6, 7 and 8, as, to the best of your recollection, the means by which you were educated about those topics, and I'm principally talking here about the operations, risk management, and various aspects of the operations, was through the vehicle of the directors' meetings you attended, and I think you've said in addition you had some outside the directors' meetings discussions with executives.
Correct.
Can I just ask you to clarify in respect to question 8? You've said that you do not recall receiving training. Is that a positive recollection that you did not receive training, or are you saying there that you may have or you may not have, you just don't remember?
Well, the answer really, with respect, is clear from the answer's there. With respect, there can be no misapprehension as to what's being said.
Well, I think you can seek the clarification, Mr. Putron.
Mate, please. Yes, so if I could ask you again, are you suggesting there that you have no recollection one way or the other, or a positive recollection that you did not receive training?
I cannot recall having, I cannot recall if I did or I didn't have any training in respect of those matters.
Okay. Now, I'm going to ask you some questions of a general nature based on your understanding today.
Yes.
And then I will ask you about the time which you became, when you may have acquired that understanding. So you may or may not agree with what I'm about to put you through.
Sure.
Establish that first. So is it your understanding, or do you appreciate that as part of their operations, I'm now talking generally about casinos, that offer gambling for entertainment, they also undertake various financial activities that are similar to those of a financial institution. For example, they accept funds, they conduct money exchange, they conduct money transfers and things of that nature.
Yes.
And they also have cash cheques and safe deposit boxes and sort of those financial institution-like activities.
Yes.
And would you accept that the business of a casino is fairly cash intensive?
Yes.
And that feature of a casino makes it an attractive venue for criminal elements?
It's speculation, but I would concur.
Well, do you accept that, broadly speaking, casinos are an attractive venue for criminals to attempt infiltration?
Yes. And
there are many ways in which they may attempt that. The common theft, attempting to defraud the casino itself in the playing of the games. Would you accept that?
Yes.
Money laundering?
Yes.
And there may be other potential crimes that they would attempt to commit in the venue.
Yes.
Now, would you accept that the Perth casino is vulnerable to criminal infiltration in those ways, in the same way that any other casino is vulnerable?
Yes.
And do you accept that if criminals were permitted to successfully infiltrate the Perth casino, it may undermine the public confidence in the trust, in the credibility and integrity of the casino gaming operations in Perth?
Could you repeat your question?
If criminals were permitted to successfully infiltrate the Perth casino, it has the potential to undermine public confidence in the credibility and integrity of the casino gaming operations in Perth.
Yes, to the qualification of, I'd need to have a bit of understanding of to the extent of. So if it was $1, I don't think it would be to the public detriment.
No, but if, for instance, the casino was involved facilitating, not necessarily knowingly, but facilitating money laundering via its operations, that has the potential to undermine public confidence.
Yes.
Now, at the time that you became a director of Burswood Casino, did you have an appreciation then of the vulnerability of the Perth Casino to the kind of criminal infiltration I've just described?
Yes.
And in the course of your tenure as a director, did that appreciation become greater?
Yes.
In the sense you became more familiar with the ways in which criminals may attempt to infiltrate the casino operations?
Yes.
And as part of the your gaining of an understanding, was one of the things that you became aware of that a vehicle through some criminals may attempt to infiltrate the casino junket operations?
Yes.
Now, leaving to one side the potential for criminal infiltration, again, I'm going to ask you some general propositions about the features of a business of casino operations. Now, while casino, in a general sense, casinos offer gaming as a form of entertainment, correct?
Yes.
But that form of entertainment is one which can result in harm to some patrons.
Correct.
And for instance, some patrons can develop an addiction to gambling.
Yes.
And in some instances that patrons can result in significant financial hardship as a consequence of losing money gambling.
Yes.
Now, would you accept this proposition that if there is a significant number of people in the community who are suffering financial hardship or problem gambling as a consequence of the operation of a casino, that may undermine public confidence again in the credibility and integrity of the casino operations?
You, just to confirm the question, that is generally?
Yes, generally.
Yes.
Now, again, with respect to taking it to the Perth Casino, the Perth Casino has the potential to cause harm in that way via offering casino gaming. Correct?
Yes.
Now, at the time of your appointment as a director of Burswood Limited, did you have that the appreciation then of the potential for harm to be caused to patrons of the Perth Casino?
Yes.
And again, during the course of your tenure as a director, did your appreciation of that potentiality become greater?
Yes.
And more refined, if you like?
In terms of my knowledge?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, now, the Perth, if I can, and again, I'm just going to put these propositions to you, and you may not agree with me, but the Perth Casino offers gaming, what I'll call in two broad categories. There are table games, and there are electronic gaming machines, or EGMs, correct?
Correct.
Now, is it your understanding, or did you gain an appreciation whilst you were a director of Burswood Limited, that patrons who regularly play the EGM games carry a higher risk of developing an addiction to gambling?
Yes.
And is that because the EGMs themselves are designed to encourage people to play them?
Can you repeat your question?
Part of the design of an EGM is to encourage patrons to play them, to continue to play on the machines. Is that your understanding?
My understanding is that EGMs form a part of an experience at the casino in terms of a gambling experience.
Okay, but and okay, let's just work it at a level of generality again.
Sure.
It's common knowledge that the odds are in favour of the house, correct?
In respect of EGMs?
Yes.
Yes.
And so, if you like, the more you play, on average, the more a person will lose.
In respect of any gambling, the same.
Yes. So, if there is an incentive on the part of the casino to encourage people to play any game, but EGMs in particular in this instance, because the more they play, the more they will lose.
Correct.
So there's an incentive on the part of the casino operator to encourage people then to play on an electronic game, in this instance, for that reason. It will add to the bottom line.
It will.
Now, the reason I'm asking you this is, whilst you were a director of Burswood Limited, appreciating the potentiality for harm via casino operations, there's a tension between that and the desire to obtain revenue from offering gaming, correct?
Correct.
And so, when, in the course of your tenure as a director, were you turning your mind at any time to that, whether or not games that were being offered for play at the Perth casino struck an appropriate balance between those aspects?
Yes.
All right. Now, I want to come back to specifically to the questions you were asked about harm minimisation later. But before I do, could I ask you? I want to get a bit of a sense of the operations of and the structure around the operations of the Perth casino. Now, you were asked a number of questions, a series of questions, and you may recall they were divided effectively into three. There were three companies of which there was a particular focus. There was Burswood Limited, of which you were a director. Another company, Burswood Nominees Limited. You're nodding, you'll need to say yes.
Yes.
And Burswood Resort Management Limited.
Yes.
Now, I'm starting at the end. I want to direct your attention to your answer to question 28. And it's a very succinct answer to, if you like, the broad roles of those three companies in the Perth casino context. So Burswood Limited is the parent, Burswood Nominees is the casino licence holder, and Burswood Resort Management was the employer, correct?
Correct.
Now, I'm going to ask you a series of questions intending to expand on those roles for those various companies. And I would like you to, and obviously it's the time you were a director, now if there are any differences between different periods that you can remember, please feel free to make that explanation and qualification. So, starting with Burswood Limited, during the period that you were a director of that company, what was the business or the commercial activity of that company itself?
The business was the unit holder for the Perthwood Property Trust.
So your understanding of its business was essentially as a holding company for the units in the Perthwood Property Trust.
That's what it was, yes.
Okay, now you have said in answer to another question that I think I've taken to this earlier, that you familiarised yourself upon your appointment with the regulatory framework, and you mentioned specifically the Burswood Island, Casino Burswood Island Agreement, the state agreement. If I can
Yes.
just use that as a shorthand, you'll know what I'm speaking of.
Yes,
Did you also have regard to the Casino Control Act at that time?
I can't recall.
Did you familiarise yourself with the Casino Control Act over the course of your tenure as a director?
I can't recall.
All right. Now, you understood, though, I think we've established that the Burswood Nominees was the holder of the casino licence in that period,
Correct.
and it was the trustee of the Burswood Property Trust.
Correct.
And as a consequence of that, you understood it was the owner of the land upon which the casino is built, the legal owner.
Which entity? Sorry.
Burswood Nominees.
Yes.
Now, Burswood Nominees is also a subsidiary, isn't it, of Burswood Limited?
Correct.
Now, you were not a director of Burswood Nominees,
Correct.
and in that context, yeah, Burswood Limited nonetheless had an interest, did it not, in the activities of Burswood Nominees, given it had a direct pecuniary connection.
The oversight of, yes.
And so in that context, did you take it upon yourself to inform yourself about the nature of Burswood Nominees' operations as well?
Yes.
Okay, and how did you do that?
The Perth Casino and its respective entities was all dealt with in board meetings of Burswood Limited. There was no demarcation in respect of each entity, and representatives from management and nominees were like directors, and we discussed those matters holistically.
Now, the just taking Burswood Nominees to start with, Burswood Nominees directors were common with the directors of Burswood Limited, correct?
I understand there were common directors.
With the exception of yourself, who obviously was not on Burswood Nominees.
Correct.
Now, those people who were directors of both Burswood Limited and Burswood Nominees held executive positions either with, I'm talking now about the period after the demerger, Crown Resorts, or the Burswood, one of the Burswood, we'll call it Perth Casino. So the executives are either the Perth Casino Group or Crown Resorts.
Crown Resorts and Perth Nominees and Perth Management. Is that what you're...
Yeah, sorry,
asking?
I've confused you with the question. I'll go back.
So just before you do, Mr. Roberts, I'm really having trouble.
Sorry.
Can you understand this is not a private conversation between you and Mr. Futrell?
Understood.
Everybody in the room needs to be able to hear you. And so could you just bear that in mind?
My apologies,
Thank
Commissioner.
you.
Now, those directors of Burswood, I'm speaking now of Burswood Nominees,
Yes.
that were both directors of Burswood Nominees and Burswood Limited, were also executives, they had executive management positions with either Crown Resorts or more broadly, I'll call it the Perth Casino Group.
That is what I recall.
They were employees within the group. They were not external appointments like yourself.
Yes.
Now, during your tenure as a director of Burswood Limited, did you turn your mind to or consider the responsibilities of the licensee of the Perth Casino licence, that is Burswood nominees, to the regulator and to the minister and effectively to the state of Western Australia?
Yes.
And did you consider that one of its responsibilities was, as licensee, was to maintain public confidence in the credibility, integrity and stability of its operations at the casino?
Yes.
And did you consider that one of its responsibilities as the licensee was to take appropriate steps to mitigate the risks of infiltration by criminal elements that we discussed earlier?
Yes.
And did you also consider one of its responsibilities, now when I say it here I mean Burswood nominees as licensee, was to take appropriate steps to mitigate the risks of harm being caused by offering gaming services?
Yes.
And in particular, did you consider it one of its responsibilities to take appropriate steps to mitigate against harm caused by EGMs?
Yes.
Okay, now you may have already clarified this for me, but if I could ask you to look at your answer to question 3, which is on 13. Sorry, it's on page 5, starting on page 5, and I won't take you to all the references, but there's a reference there at the bottom of the page. If you found that, this is on page 5 at the top, and in fact at the bottom as well. It says, my recollection of the structure of the Burswood group of companies is that Burswood Resort Management was the employer. You're using a term there, Burswood group of companies. I just want to understand, in your mind, what companies fall within that description. So,
Burswood Resort Management, Burswood Nominees, and Burswood Limited.
were there any other operating companies or other companies that you consider fell within that description?
That I can recall.
What about the trust structures? Would you consider that part of the group, the unit trust?
Yes.
Okay, now you've said here and elsewhere in your statement that your understanding was that Burswood Resort Management was the employer.
Yes.
To your knowledge, did Burswood Limited have any of its employees of its own?
No.
And what about Burswood Nominees?
I can't recall.
And did you familiarise yourself also with the terms of the Burswood Property Trust Deed?
I can't recall.
Did you have an understanding of the manner in which, if any, there was a division of responsibility between the trustee of the trust, Burswood Nominees, and the manager of that trust?
Could you repeat the question, sorry?
Did you have an understanding of, broadly speaking, of the structure of the trust deed, trustee and manager?
Yes.
And what was your understanding of who was the manager of under the trust deed?
Burswood Nominees.
Was the manager or the trustee?
Sorry, the trustee.
And the manager?
can't recall.
All right, now, would it be fair to say that during your tenure as a director of Burswood Limited, I think Mr. Poynton was also a director for that entire period?
That's my recollection.
And in that period, Mr. Poynton and yourself were the only two directors of Burswood Limited that were not also executives of either Crown Resorts or what you've described as the Burswood Group of companies.
Correct.
With respect to, I've dealt with Burswood nominees, with respect to Burswood Resort Management, is it your recollection the situation was the same? That is to say, there were executives of the group who were the directors of that company?
I can't recall, but sorry, repeat your question.
So, in the case of Burswood Resort Management,
Yes,
it had some common directors with Burswood Limited.
that is my understanding, yes.
You were not a director of Burswood Resort Management.
Correct.
Mr. Poynton was not a director of Burswood Resort Management.
I can't speak on behalf of Mr. Poynton.
Okay. To your knowledge, was he a director of Burswood Resort Management?
I can't recall.
Again, I think you're going to need to speak up a bit.
Sorry, I can't recall.
Okay. To the best of your recollection, who were the directors of Burswood Resort Management let's start with the time of your departure in 2019?
I wasn't on the board of Burswood Resort Management, and I'm not sure who the directors were of Burswood Resort Management.
Okay. Was it your understanding that Burswood Resort Management, or the ultimate holding company, a parent company of that company, Burswood Resort Management, was Burswood Limited?
Correct.
So, as a director of Burswood Limited, were you not interested to know who the directors of a subsidiary of that company were?
Yes, but I can't recall who they are.
Okay, the specific names of the people.
Yes.
Can you recall now that whether they were external appointments like yourself, or they were executives of the group?
My recollection is they were executives of the group.
Now, Burswood, can I ask you this question? During your tenure as a director of Burswood Limited, were there any committees of the Burswood Limited board addressing either audit or risk management?
My recollection is that there was an audit committee and a risk committee.
And is this what you refer to in your statement as the ERCC?
Correct.
And is that an acronym for Executive Risk Compliance
Committee. Correct.
And was it your understanding that though the members of that committee were executives of the group?
Correct.
Neither yourself nor Mr. Poynton sat on as a member of that committee.
Correct.
And so you describe it as a committee of Burswood Limited, do you?
It was, my recollection, it was of Burswood Limited.
To the best of your recollection, was there an occasion when a resolution was passed by the board of Burswood Limited to establish that committee?
I can't recall.
to the best of your recollection, was there a charter that established the remit of the ERCC?
I can't recall.
So in what manner do you consider it to have been a committee of the Burswood Limited board?
I recall that there was a risk and audit committee, and as you know, through my tenure, there were, as part of the wider Crown Group, other services provided by Crown as a whole, and whether they sat within the Burswood entity, subsequently through assistance of Crown or through Burswood management, I can't recall.
So just to return to the question,
Sorry.
what I'm interested to understand, and it'd be great if you could let the Commission know your understanding.
Yes.
You have described the ERCC as a committee of Burswood Limited. What I'm interested to understand is why you say it was a committee of Burswood Limited itself, as opposed to a committee of executives of Crown Resorts, for instance, or Burswood nominees, or Burswood Resort Management.
As I said before, that the Perth casino operations was not pigeonholed into nominees, management, and as Burswood Limited, we considered all those matters, and there was an executive committee that was responsible for the risk and audit, and therefore I can't recall where it sat, but therefore ultimately it provided that services for the board.
Okay, now, but Burswood Limited, its activity was to be a unit holder, correct?
Correct.
So the ERCC, its function, its risk management function, was with respect to what operations of Burswood Limited?
Well, Burswood nominees and Burswood management were subsidiaries, and Burswood Limited would be required to provide some oversight in that regard.
I see. So it's your understanding that the ERCC reported to Burswood Limited effectively on all operations of the Burswood Group?
That is my understanding.
Now, again, just to assist with clarity, there are a number of places in your statement where you have referred to the executive team.
Yes.
I'll give you an example. Your answer to question 15 on page 6. I'll come back to the body of the answer, but you'll see there in the fourth line in the sentence beginning, moreover, my recollection is the executive team reported. You've used it there, and you've used it in other places. Then if I could direct your attention to question 19, the answer is on page 7. And you make a reference there to repeating your answer to question 12. And the next layer of management was the CEO. So have you got that in front of you?
Yes.
Legal and compliance officer,
Yes.
CFO, secretary, etc. And you go on to say they each have their own management team. So if I could just ask you, when you're referring to the executive team, are you describing that as that group of people you have referred to in question 19 or some other group of people?
Yes, they were the executive team.
So when you say executive team in your statement, we can read it as meaning the CEO, legal and compliance officer, CFO, oblique secretary, and COO.
Yes.
Okay, now, when you say CEO, Chief Executive Officer, of which companies which company is that person the CEO?
As I said, that Burswood Limited, there was no distinction at the board level between Burswood Limited, Burswood Nominees and Burswood Management, and the CEO was the CEO across the Perth operations.
Okay, so again, if I'm wrong, I just want to summarise this so just so I understand it. It was the CEO of what you have described elsewhere as the Burswood Group of Companies.
Yes.
And the Burswood Group of Companies is a subset of the Crown Resorts Group.
It's a subsidiary.
But there's a subset of companies that fall under, that are subsidiaries of Crown Resorts that
Yes.
you are describing as the Burswood Group.
Could you repeat your question?
There's a subset of companies you describe as the Burswood Group that are also subsidiaries ultimately of Crown Resorts.
Yes, they are the ultimate shareholder.
And you would put at the head of the Burswood Group, Burswood Limited, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So again, so the CEO is of the Burswood Group. The legal and compliance officer is of the Burswood Group.
Yes.
CFO of the Burswood Group.
Yes.
Secretary of the Burswood Group.
Yes.
Meaning, I presume, the secretary of each of the companies in that group.
Well, I can only, in that circumstance, it would be in regard to Burswood Limited.
Okay. And COO is Chief Operating Officer, is that correct?
Correct.
Of the Burswood Group.
Correct.
All right. So that whenever we see executive team, that's who you mean.
Correct.
Now, just again for clarity, in response to question 12, I could take you there, it's on page 5. And I know you've effectively confirmed this already. So I'm not so concerned about the substance of the answer, but how it fits with your answer to question 19. So you'll see that question 12 is directed to the activities and structure of Burswood Nominees, and your answer has been given, which is there were some common directors, but you can't recall the specific structure. Then question 19 over the page, a couple of pages forward, at the top of 7, you're asked a question about the structure applicable to Burswood Limited, and you repeat your answer to question 12. I'm just trying to understand why you are repeating the answer to Burswood Nominees in answer to a question to Burswood Limited. Is there a reason for that, or is it just a matter of expediency?
In question 12, I'm saying I can't recall. I know there were some directors, I can't recall the exact management structure, and
Of Burswood nominees?
of Burswood nominees,
Yes.
and again, because Burswood Burswood Limited had no employees, the management structure was the CEO, legal compliance officer, CFO and COO within the Burswood group of companies.
All right. Now, you've probably already answered this. I just want to be clear, make sure I'm clear about this. Those, I'm just going to refer to them as the executive team now, had the day-to-day responsibility for the operations of the Perth Casino via its owner, Burswood Nominees.
Correct.
Okay. So in terms of the structure then, again, so I understand it correctly, you have the same executive team applying, working for all companies within the Burswood Group.
Yes.
You have at the top Burswood Limited with yourself and Mr. Poynton as external appointments.
Yes.
And then the companies that are undertaking the day-to-day activities and have the responsibility for employment and ownership of the property and the casino licence. The directors of those companies are executives of the group.
Yes.
And the executives of the group are undertaking the day-to-day management tasks.
Yes.
And the executives of the group also comprise the ERCC.
Yes.
Now, with respect to the executive appointments, as to say, each of the people who were part of the executive team, who appointed them?
I can't recall.
Do you recall if there was any meetings of, excuse me, any meetings of Burswood Limited at which the appointment of, for instance, the CEO of the group was discussed?
I can't recall.
When you say you can't recall, is that you simply don't remember at all, or you have a positive recollection there was no such meeting?
I can't recall.
As in, no recollection?
No recollection.
Do you recall if there was a contract of employment between, again in this case, the CEO of the Burswood Group and Burswood Limited?
As Burswood Limited didn't employ anyone, I would say no.
Was there, to the best of your recollection, any document that described the role of the CEO of the Burswood Group?
Not that I can recall.
Was there any document, or to your recollection, or any meetings at which there was any discussion of delegation of powers to the CEO of the Burswood Group?
Yes.
And what was the nature of the delegations of powers discussed?
My recollection was that there was a delegation provided to the CEO in respect of AML CTF framework.
All right. Now, what was in respect of that? What is your understanding of the company within the group that had responsibility for implementation of the AML CTF framework?
Well, there was Burswood Limited had an oversight of the Perth operations, and therefore as I said, could you repeat the question? Sorry.
What was your understanding? Which company within the group, the Burswood Group I'm referring to,
Yes.
did you understand to have the responsibility for implementation of the AML CTF framework?
would be the Burswood nominees.
Burswood nominees. So you were not a director of Burswood nominees.
No.
So in what way was Burswood Limited delegating power to the CEO to implement a program for Burswood nominees?
Burswood Limited had a requirement to provide oversight in regard to those subsidiaries. And as I said, at board level, there was no distinction between Burswood nominees, Burswood management, when we were having a Burswood Limited board meeting.
I see. So we're talking in commercial practicality rather than legal specifics.
Yes,
So there was an endorsement, if you like, of the AML CTF program by the Burswood Limited board.
as I said, there was no distinction in regard to Burswood Limited's board meetings between the respective entities. We inherited that structure.
I see. Leaving aside AML and CTF, were there any other occasions that you can recall where there was a delegation of a power from the board of Burswood Limited to the CEO of the group?
Other than the one
You
that
just
I've
described.
provided, I can't recall.
All right. Now, to the best of your recollection, was the board of Burswood Limited responsible, or did it undertake to establish key performance indicators for the CEO of the Burswood Group?
I can't recall.
Is it your understanding that the CEO of the Burswood Group reported directly to the board of Crown Resorts?
Yes,
And is that also the case for the legal and compliance officer of the group
yes,
and the CFO of the group
yes.
and the chief operations officer of the group?
I can't recall.
All right. So for those that you have identified, your understanding is they made a direct report to the Crown Resorts board
Through Burswood Limited.
through Burswood Limited. So
Yes.
is it your evidence that Burswood Limited itself reported on its activities to the Crown Resorts board?
It's my understanding, yes.
And in what manner was that reporting undertaken?
There was obviously common executives
Common executives meaning.
from Crown.
So to your knowledge, was there a formal process? And I mean, for instance, a report prepared for and on behalf of Burswood Limited, approved by the Burswood Limited board, that was then transmitted to the board of Crown Resorts?
I can't recall.
When you say then that there was the commonality of executives, are you really saying that there was because there was that such commonality, there was an assumption that information would be passed on to the Crown Resorts board?
Yeah, I would think that the Crown Resort Board would have available the minutes of the meetings held at Burswood Limited.
All right. So is it your understanding then that the Burswood Limited board minutes were passed on to Crown Resorts?
I can't comment on Crown.
You're making that assumption though, because that's what you regard as good corporate practice, correct?
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily. So as a director of a company for which there are subsidiaries, you would not expect that the board of the parent to receive minutes of the, at least the most important subsidiary companies?
Not on the basis, for example, Burswood Limited, you had, as I said, there was no delineation, there was no pigeonholing of those entities, and we discussed the entire Perth operations at ward level. So therefore, for me to become knowledgeable and understand in regard to what was going on at nominees or management, all of those matters would be discussed at Burswood Limited's meetings. So minutes wouldn't be required.
Right, so we might be slightly at cross purposes. So you're suggesting, are you, that you did not receive minutes of the meetings of Burswood nominees or any other company within the Burswood group, other than Burswood Limited itself?
That is my recollection.
And is it your evidence that that didn't concern you at that time, you were a director, because you were receiving information directly from the executives of those companies at Burswood Limited meetings?
It didn't concern me because, one, I was getting the information. Secondly, I was being provided a very detailed board pack that I thought that provided a in-depth analysis in regard to the operations, compliance and otherwise. That was also had a very detailed internal audit, and subsequent there were other external audit packs made available.
All right, now that's the Burswood Group, and we have digressed somewhat. So I was asking you actually about how you were aware, if you were aware, that the activities of Burswood Limited and the Burswood Group were reported to Crown Resorts.
I can't. I have no knowledge of that.
All right. So I think in answer to one of my earlier questions, you suggested you couldn't recall any formal papers being transmitted, and I think you mentioned there was a commonality of executives.
Correct.
So is it the case that you assumed that the Burswood Group activities would be reported to Crown Resorts because there was a commonality in the executive team?
No.
That'd be a convenient.
Yes, we'll come back at 11:30. Thank you.
All rise.
Thank you, Mr. Roberts. Neutral.
No, it pleases the Commission. Mr. Roberts, I've been handed yet another note to remind you to speak up. If you don't mind it, you might have to, in your mind, think you're shouting in order for the rest of us to hear you, if you don't mind.
My apologies.
All right, now, can I take you back to your statement again? Another matter I would like to ask you for clarification. In you asked some questions. Question 15, which is on page 6. You asked some questions about the extent of influence of Burswood Limited over Burswood Nominees. I understand, I think, from some of the things you said earlier today around the way in which the board of Burswood Limited viewed the group as a whole and people reporting to you as a whole, essentially as one entity or one structure. What I'm interested in is you have made reference here in the last sentence to the executive team reporting to Burswood Limited with respect to the group aspects. And you've then said the Burswood Limited board, it was the Burswood Limited board that made the primary decisions. What do you mean there by primary decisions?
Ultimately, as we as a board would give considerations to matters arising and make a decision, and the executives would then carry out those respective duties.
Okay, so just so I understand what you mean by primary decision, do you mean a resolution of the board
I do.
that will be minuted
I do.
and recorded?
I do.
Okay, so if it's not a decision of that character, you would not describe it as a primary decision?
I would say that's correct.
Okay, so and I think in another answer you said day-to-day operations were dealt with by the executive team.
Correct.
So would it be fair to say that all decision-making taking place with respect to the operations of the Burswood Group that is not recorded in a minute of a resolution of the Burswood Limited Board was not a primary decision in your view?
Oh, you would have to give me an example for me to opine on that.
All right. I'm just trying to understand what you meant by primary decision, really. Now, there were minutes kept at Burswood Limited meetings,
Correct.
and one of the first items of the agenda of each meeting following would be to review the minutes.
Correct.
And again, I'm talking in generalities here. They were typically approved after any amendments were made to them.
Correct.
And if you had voiced any concerns about the accuracy of them at the time, you would have done so.
Correct.
So would it be fair to say that this Commission can rely on the minutes of the Burswood Limited meetings as an accurate record of what took place at those meetings?
Correct.
Now, if I could direct your attention to question 21, and your answer is on page 7. I'm now talking about this is just dealing with the extent to which there was influence from the company structures above Burswood Limited in the broader Crown Resorts Group. And you have said in part of your answer that Burswood Limited had careful regard to and, where appropriate, adopted various matters such as branding, vision, policies and procedures by way of shared learning across the group. The group there, I take it you're referring to Crown Resorts more widely than the Burswood group.
Correct.
And are you suggesting in that paragraph that if a decision was made at the Crown Resorts board level to implement a change in branding or a particular strategy of some kind, a policy or procedure, it was then considered at the Burswood Limited board and a decision made whether it would be accepted or not?
That's what I can recall.
And are you indicating by that statement that if Burswood Limited, the board, disagreed with the implementation of a decision of of Crown Resorts, it would not have been implemented?
If that had been the case,
Now, given at that time the majority of the directors of Burswood Limited were executives of the Crown Group, were they not?
that's my recollection.
And would you accept that each of those individuals ultimately was accountable to Crown Resorts Limited?
As a shareholder, yes.
No, I'm talking about the executives who were also directors of Burswood Limited.
Through the respective subsidiaries through to Crown, yes.
So they ultimately were accountable to Crown Resorts.
Yes.
Can you recall any instance of any decision made by Crown Resorts that was brought to the Burswood Limited board for consideration that was not accepted?
No, except for the qualification of those matters was sometimes robustly discussed.
Can you give me, can you give the Commission, an example of an issue that arose at the Burswood Limited level that was a subject of robust discussion?
I can't recall if it was actually at the board meeting or prior to a board meeting. We talked about whether the best way forward in respect of the development of the hotel would be undertaken by on-selling the rooms under a strata arrangement and with a management lease in place, or alternatively own the hotel outright. And I remember that having quite some debate.
Okay. Can you remember any instances where, for instance, a policy, such as a risk management policy, that was implemented by Crown Resorts was the subject of robust discussion?
I can't recall.
Okay, if I could turn now, I want to turn now to the question of risk management. And this is in question 30. Your response to that is at page 8 and 9. You have said in response to that question, it's about a third of the way down page 9, that you do not recall there being a set approach or attitude of Burswood Limited to risk appetite and risk tolerance at any time during your tenure as a director? A little earlier in your statement, I'll take you now to question 11. On page 5. So that's not the correct reference. There's a reference to there having been a compliance report and a risk register. I've got the wrong reference, I'm sorry, to one of the answers. Yes, I'm sorry, it's question 18. And this appears on page 6 and page 7. And you're describing there the risk management system applicable to Burswood Limited. I just want to clarify my understanding of this is accurate. A little earlier today we dealt with the ERCC, or the committee, and part of its activities was to consider risk and manage risk.
Yes.
And you said it reported to the Burswood Limited board.
Correct.
And you have said in answer to that question 18 that there was a risk matrix and an associated risk register that was used to assess the risks in Burswood Limited's activities.
Yes.
Now, in light of the evidence you have given earlier today, do you mean by Burswood Limited, should we really be understanding it to mean the Burswood Group?
The Perth Casino specifically.
Perth Casino. Now, were you aware of the risk management matrix? Had you been provided with a copy of that at the board level?
Yes, it was a very detailed document.
And the risk, did you have access to the risk register as well?
My recollection within the ERCC reporting was a very detailed risk register, specific issues in respect of risk, how it was addressed, and then followed through to have a risk matrix behind it.
Okay, and the responsibility for developing the risk matrix and the risk register lay with the ERCC, is that correct?
That is my recollection.
Do you have a recollection of whether, having developed that risk matrix and risk register, it was brought to the Burswood Limited board for consideration and approval?
I can't recall.
But you recall the knowing of the existence of those aspects of the risk management?
I'm aware of those aspects of the risk management, yes.
Okay, now, if I could take you back to answer to question 29, where you indicate that you don't recall there being a set approach or attitude to risk appetite and risk tolerance. I'm sorry, question 30. Are you there speaking of the board of Burswood Limited?
Yes.
So is it your evidence that the board of Burswood Limited did not establish or set the approach to risk appetite for the purposes of the ERCC's risk matrix?
As I said, I can't recall.
So when you say you can't recall there being a set approach or attitude, do you mean you have no recollection of the approach or attitude? Or that
Yes, I have a very clear understanding of the attitude
Right, what was the attitude?
in terms of compliance and risk management, that Burswood had a strong and front of mind approach in regard to those matters.
And how would you describe then the risk appetite of Burswood Limited, the board of Burswood Limited, to the risks facing the Burswood Casino?
I would say it would have a low risk.
A low risk. And how was that communicated, if at all, to the executive team?
It was communicated by way of an assurance of compliance and seeking clarification in regard to risk items that required attention and our desire to provide continuous improvement in regard to all items of policy and framework around the business operations.
Was the way in which Burswood Limited approached risk management consistent or similar to the approach that you had adopted in other companies of which you were a director?
The risk, I saw the ERCC, or certainly the function of the risk management, to be well reported, in depth, and provide ample information to the board, and therefore be consistent with other companies. Yes.
What I mean to say is the adoption of a risk matrix, a risk register, and reporting against those risks to the board, was that consistent with your experience as a director of other companies?
Yes.
And in your experience as a director of other companies, have there been occasions where there are sessions between the management team and the directors that take place outside of a normal directors meeting, where strategy and risk is the subject of a day or a half-day workshop?
There has been at times, yes.
And were there any sessions of that character whilst you were a director of Burswood Limited?
No, but to the qualification that I was confident this was part of a broader group, which, as I was advised, did undertake that role.
Okay, so you were advised that the directors of the board of Crown Resorts undertook the kind of session I've described?
Yes.
And were you given any indication of who the participants were in such a session?
I can't recall.
Would it be your expectation that the key managers of Burswood, the Burswood Group, would have participated in such a session?
Yes.
And is it your expectation that the directors of Burswood Resorts would have conveyed to the executives the risk tolerance of Crown Resorts?
Burswood Resorts?
No, Crown Resorts.
You said Burswood in your question.
Oh, Crown Resorts.
Would you mind repeating
Yes.
the question?
Would it be your expectation that any session involving the Crown Resorts board and executive, that the Crown Resorts expectation of risk tolerance would be communicated to them?
To the board of Burswood?
To the executives involved in the session.
Sorry, I'm
Okay.
lost with you.
Take one step at a time.
That's right.
I think you've accepted that, well, you've said that it was your understanding there were sessions involving directors of the Crown Resorts Board and executives of Crown Resorts, including some who participated in the management of the Burswood Casino.
The group as a whole, correct.
Is it your expectation that the risk tolerance of Crown Resorts Group would have been communicated to the executives of the Crown Group, including the Burswood Group executives, at such a session?
I can only speculate.
I'm happy for you to speak. Is your expectation that that is what would have occurred?
That is what I assume would have occurred.
Yes, because if you were not satisfied that that had taken place, how would you know that the ERCC, for example, understood what the risk tolerance of the group was?
The ERCC was became a group, an overall group committee, but it specifically also dealt with those matters in respect of audit matters that were applicable to compliance at the Perth casino level.
Okay, so is it your understanding that the ERCC had a dual function? It considered risks of the Crown Group broadly, and it considered risks associated with Perth casino operations specifically.
Yes.
And it reported to Crown Resorts?
No, it reported to Crown Resorts on one hand and to Burswood Limited on the other.
Yes, I was coming to that. So it reported, in your understanding is it reported to both boards?
I can't speculate on behalf of Crown.
But is it your understanding it was reporting to both Crown Resorts and to Burswood Limited?
My knowledge was it reported, well, I know it reported to Burswood Limited.
Okay. Now, if I ask you to have regard to question 9 and your response to a question regarding your responsibilities as a director of Burswood Limited.
Yes.
It's on page 4 and page 5. Now, there's no reference, I believe, in the answers there to an understanding of the responsibilities of directors of Burswood Limited for the oversight of risk management. Do you accept that the Burswood Limited board had response?
Well, Your Honour, Commissioner, the question is posed in terms of his understanding of his responsibilities as a director, not the responsibilities of the board.
Yeah, refer it at the individual.
So, insofar as response to the question goes, it is directed to your understanding of responsibilities as a director of Burswood Limited. You've not mentioned in your response any responsibility for oversight of risk management, correct?
Correct.
Now, do you accept, though, that as a director of Burswood Limited, you did have responsibility to oversee the identification and management of risks associated with the Perth casino?
Yes.
Now, you can disagree with this if you. I just want to understand what your view is. During your tenure as a director of Burswood Limited, is it the case that the directors of Burswood Limited were not taking the lead in setting the strategy and management of risk?
So, would you mind repeating your question?
The board of directors of Burswood Limited was not taking the lead, as in the lead role, in setting the strategy and management of risk for the Burswood Group.
The Burswood board took, and as I said, front of mind the importance of managing risk within the company, and had the ability to draw on the resources of the greater Crown Group in regard to risk management.
Yes, I'm dealing here. I'm not suggesting there was no role participating in risk management. My question is directed to whether it took the lead role in identification and management of risk for the Perth Casino.
I can't tell you whether it took the lead role or not the lead role. What I can tell you as a director was that risk was front and centre, and that we undertook assurance that risk was well managed within Burswood Limited.
Okay. There were occasions, were there not, when in the course of your review of Burswood Limited papers, there were internal audits that had taken place.
Correct.
And in some instances, the internal audit reports identified failings of different kinds in the implementation of the policies of the group.
There were minor risk outcomes that were identified, and my recollection was there was a remedial action against that risk if there was a breach of or away from company policy in that regard, and that was, as I said, contained in a very in-depth way within the risk management papers, and that was then identified by what level of risk was assessed by the ERCC, and my recollection that it was never anything identified that was a red flag and caused me as a director of great concern, or of any concern.
So is it your evidence that in, I haven't done the maths, but quite a number of years that you were director of Burswood Limited,
Yes.
there was not a single instance of any breach of policy or compliance matter that raised a red flag in your mind?
There was no occasion when I was a director that on the detail provided in regard to the ERCC reports that provided any red flags to me in regard to the risk audits being undertaken by the ERCC.
In your experience in the other 300 companies of which you've been a director, is that unusual that there is not any examples of breaches of company policy that raise red flags?
On my recollection, that in well-managed businesses that I can't recall seeing red flags in regard to matters.
Well, the absence of red flags could mean one of two things. It could mean everything's been run perfectly well and there's compliance with the internal policies, or it could mean there's not adequate audit being undertaken of the internal policies, couldn't it?
That's speculation, yes.
But did it occur to you when you were director of Burswood Limited that the absence of any red flags, as you've called them, sparked in your mind the possibility there was not adequate audit being undertaken?
No, because front and centre that the board was very, as I saw, very astute to risk management, and going to the audit reports themselves, my recollection was that they were incredibly thorough. They provided a very deep analysis across the entire Perth casino operations of risk review, and was also supported by other legal and compliance reports which were consistent with the ERCC's findings.
Are you familiar with the findings made by the Bergen inquiry regarding?
No, I'm not.
Have you read about any of that in the news?
No.
So you're unaware of the conclusions drawn in the Bergen report regarding the facilitation of money laundering at Burswood Casino?
I am not familiar, no.
During your tenure as a director of Burswood Limited, you were provided with board packs before each meeting?
Of course.
In your view, were they provided to you sufficient time of 4 meetings for you to consider them in detail?
My recollection that they were.
All right. Now, can I just for the sake of identifying a typical example of what was on the agenda, if I
Yes.
could ask you to call up CRW 702.001.1322, which I think is just an example from a time when you were a director. Having considered that, if you just take a little time to read it, does it generally accord with your recollection of the topics discussed at, or the subject matter of a typical meeting in the period of your directorship?
Yes.
Okay, and you have mentioned a number of times there's reference to internal audit and legal and risk compliance. You can see they are items on a typical agenda, and there were papers concluded in the board packs in relation to those matters. Now I'm going to put to you a series of propositions. Again, feel free to disagree with them because you may take a different view. But I can just tell you these are based on having read a number of minutes and having some knowledge of them. Would it be fair to say that the board met about 4 times a year, quarterly?
Correct.
And do you consider that's a sufficiently frequent number of meetings for a company with responsibility for the Perth Casino to meet?
I saw, as my tenure on the board, that it was an ample amount of meetings for the period.
Okay, so once a quarter, in your view, was a sufficient number of meetings per annum for the directors to remain informed and undertake oversight of the operations?
Yes.
Could I ask that document PCRC.0007, .0001, .0001 be brought up? This is an aid memoir, Mr. Roberts, which is dealing with summarising the meetings held each year and the duration. And without going into them in great detail, would it be fair to say that most meetings of the board of Burswood Limited, the duration was approximately an hour.
Yes.
And in your case, would it be fair to say that in the year before your resignation, you attended every meeting by telephone?
Correct.
And that's in sort of 2018. And then you attended the majority of meetings between 2013 and 2018 also by telephone.
Yes.
Now, part of the explanation for that probably is I think you moved to New Zealand in 2017.
Yes.
And for the earlier period, were you living overseas?
I was. Sorry, I'll correct that. I wasn't living overseas. I'd spent a considerable amount of time overseas.
Okay, so you're absent from the Western Australia quite a bit.
Yes.
And in your experience, is attendance by telephone the most effective means of participating in a board meeting?
That's my view is that I saw that it posed no issue with me attending to my director duties.
Sorry, Mr. Roberts, your voice is
Sorry,
dropping again.
I didn't see that attending by telephone in any way affected my director's duties and my duties to the board.
Okay. Can I, and again, you're free to disagree with this proposition if you wish, but given that the directors of Burswood Limited met 4 times a year and the durations of the meetings were around an hour, as a consideration of the affairs in a quorum of the directors of around 4 hours a year, do you consider that to have been adequate for you and the other members of that board to discharge their duties to the company?
May I explain that whilst the board was minutes only reflected that that the meeting went for an hour, there was substantive discussions prior to all board meetings that I can recall with other directors in regard to matters of concern or of query that would be undertaken prior to any board meeting and also post those board meetings. Further, that the CEO, Mr. Barry Felstead, provided regular updates to me in between board meetings.
Okay, so you consider yourself to have been sufficiently informed because you were receiving regular updates from Mr. Felstead between board meetings, correct?
One part.
One
yes.
part. And you had other discussions unminuted discussions with members of the board of Burswood Limited?
Correct.
And were those, just to get a sense of what we're dealing with, were they discussions that you had having received a board pack?
Yes.
Questions about what was in it?
Yes.
And would it be fair to say in that context you directing your inquiries to one of the executives of the Burswood Group, Mr. Felstead, for example?
In most regard, yes.
And were there any occasions when you had discussions with the other, if you like, the non-executive director, Mr. Poynton, about the subject matter of the meetings?
Yes.
In the course of your tenure as a director of Burswood Limited, were there any occasions when you considered it necessary, or did you consider the possibility of seeking advice from an external consultant or external source about the way in which the Burswood Group operations should be managed?
No, because there was no concern for me to do so.
Now, a little earlier when I asked you some questions about the way in which you informed yourself of the operations of the Burswood or Perth Casino, I think you mentioned you had made some attendances at the casino with at least one executive.
Yes.
Were you ever interested to, or did you ever conduct an unofficial inspection of the casino to familiarise yourself in a less structured way with the operations?
Yes.
And how frequently would you say you undertook those kinds of inspections?
They were normally accompanied with walk-arounds of the property with the CEO, and I would walk around with Mr. Felstead and others, whereby we reviewed the property, talked about the development. As you can appreciate, there was a long period of development. Over 1.1 billion was expended on the property, and part of those property inspections, we then went and visited the gaming floors and the operations, including the F&B facilities, entertainment, conventions, lyric theatres, VIP gambling, etc.
So did you take the opportunity to observe VIP gambling in one of the salons taking place?
I don't believe I visited the salons while it was taking place, but I saw a salon and I was explained how it operated.
Were you taken and shown the way in which the cage operates?
Yes, I was.
And was that in the context of one of these visits with the CEO?
With the CEO and others.
And did you ever take the opportunity to just turn up unannounced and have a look?
Not as my primary objective, but I attended Burswood occasionally for functions, and therefore I took an interest, obviously, in the operations.
Okay. Now, I wanted to move to a slightly different topic. You asked some questions about the AML and CTF program, and you've mentioned in your answer to a number of questions the existence of that program. And I'm just going to refer you to the questions, which is 35 on page 11, 36 also on page 11, and 37 on the same page. And if you just maybe hold that page open and flick back to question 6, it's on page 3, because it also contains a reference there to the introduction of a program in around 2007. So to help you on page 3.
Oh, my apologies.
Yeah, sorry. Towards the end of the page, in the last major paragraph, about halfway through, you said in regard to AML CTF.
Yes, I
It was introduced. Now,
thank you.
You obviously recall the introduction of that program in 2007.
Yes.
Were you at that time? Did you take the opportunity to familiarise yourself with the legislative framework?
I can't recall.
When did you receive a briefing on it from Mr. Preston?
I can recall that We were briefed by the Chief Compliance Officer, yes.
Okay. Now, this is not time specific. This is today, and I'll ask you, when you may have developed this understanding, if you have. Did you have an appreciation or understanding of the entity within the Burswood Group that had responsibility to discharge the regulatory obligations under the AML CTF legislation?
I believe so.
And which entity was that?
Well, strictly nominees, yet Burswood Limited would require oversight.
Okay, so it was your understanding that Burswood nominees had the statutory obligation,
Yes,
and those directly responsible for filling that function would have been the directors of Burswood nominees, would they not?
yes,
So the oversight that you're describing is as Burswood Limited as the head of the Burswood Group.
yes.
Do you recall the structure of the AML CTF program?
No,
Do you recall whether during the course of your tenure there were any reviews of the program?
yes.
Approximately how many reviews do you remember?
Only one in 2010, I believe.
All right. Now, the review in 2010, was that initiated by the board of Burswood Limited or by the management?
I can't recall.
Now, a little earlier you gave a description of the information you received on risk management. To the best of your recollection, did that include specifically reporting on AML and CTF risks?
Yes,
And in the course of your tenure on the Burswood Limited board, was there occasions when there was, if you like, what you described as robust discussion with the executive about compliance with AML and CTF?
yes. All compliance was front of mind in regard to Burswood Limited, and we were briefed. Firstly, we were briefed by the compliance officer, Josh Preston, and again that there was very sufficient information in regard to AML, in regard to the risk papers, and there was further, I recall further sign off by legal in that regard.
Okay, now, clearly the introduction of that legislation by the Commonwealth Government was a significant event,
Yes,
and it was directed obviously to not only money laundering but counter-terrorism as well. In that context, did you consider it part of your responsibility as a director of Burswood Limited to receive some more detailed training or understanding of the casino's vulnerabilities for money laundering and or counter-terrorism financing? Terrorism financing, sorry.
could you repeat your question?
Did you consider it part of your responsibility or as a director of Burswood Limited upon the introduction of that legislation to educate yourself more fulsomely about money laundering and terrorism financing in the context of casino operations?
No, because I believe the presentations to the board in respect of the legislation and our respective framework around that was sufficient.
In order to form a view or an assessment of the adequacy of, for example, the program, did you consider it necessary to have at least some more in-depth understanding of the ways in which money laundering or terrorism financing may take place in the casino operations?
Because, as I said before, that I believe that, well, I was given a very sound overview.
Okay, so you were satisfied, were you, by the information provided to you by the executive team that the responsibilities of Burswood nominees and effectively yourself as a director were being discharged by the steps that the executives were taking place, were undertaking?
So, as I said before, we were providing the oversight, and I was satisfied that they were undertaking their obligation as they required.
Do you now have an understanding of what money laundering involves at a casino?
Yes.
What could you describe for the commissioners, please, your understanding of what forms money laundering may take in the casino operations?
Yes, there's a number, patron to patron. There is, I'm not sure of the exact wording, but collation of monies put into bank accounts where, on one hand, they look like individual transactions, but on others, they're linked. Simply cash going to be exchanged for within the cage, etc.
And do you now have any understanding of the ways in which the casino addressed the risks you've just described?
My only recollection is in regard to how we addressed AML and CTF whilst I was a director.
So I don't expect you to have understood the detail. You didn't have an understanding of the detail of the program, only that a program existed and it was intended to deal with those vulnerabilities.
I understood there to be a program that was sufficient, appropriate, and dealt with those matters and being compliant by law.
Leaving aside, so again, I'll just ask you to deal with this by proposition. So on the one hand, you've got compliance, whereby effectively the regulator imposes on an organisation a minimum set of standards it must achieve in order to comply with the legislative framework. So if you take, say, AML CTF, for example, there's an example where the relevant reporting entity must comply with certain standards, and you were receiving reports against the compliance with those standards.
Correct.
Did you consider at all whether there was a responsibility on the part of the casino licensee to go above and beyond the minimum standard in the legislation and guard against vulnerabilities to criminal infiltration that were not necessarily covered by the AML and CTF program?
As I said previously, my understanding was that they were compliant by law. I could only take into account the board pack that would provide me with the relevant reports in that regard. I saw that those reports were sufficient and provided me with advice. I further had comfort that they, again, were part of the broader Crown Group, and that as we had done at Burswood Limited, that we had always endeavoured to have a continuous improvement philosophy behind the way the business was run. Therefore, if that was followed by the executives, then the AML program would be seeking best practice.
I see. So can I want to understand the answer to that question properly. The question was directed to whether or not you had turned your mind to whether the licensee should be doing more than what was strictly required under the legislation to address vulnerabilities. In the course of your answer, you made reference to continuous improvement and best practice. Was the point of making reference to those topics to suggest that, in your mind at least, the program that was implemented went above and beyond what was strictly required to comply with legislation and addressed additional vulnerabilities?
I apologise, I've now understood your question
Yes.
more, and the answer is I can't recall.
I see. So you do not recall whether you turned your mind to considering if the licensee should do more than what was strictly required under legislation?
I can't know.
Do you consider that the licensee of the Perth Casino should have, through its corporate governance structure, considered going beyond what was strictly required in the legislative framework?
I didn't have an understanding of. Sorry.
As a general proposition, do you think the licensee of the Perth Casino has an obligation or responsibility to guard against vulnerabilities of criminal infiltration that go beyond compliance with this AML-CTF structure?
That is speculating, because I can't tell you whether sorry, it's probably best I say it's speculating.
I'm actually asking you to speculate. So this is about your view as an individual, a person who has sat for many years as a director of Burswood Limited, whether your view is that the licensee of the Perth Casino should, not whether it did or does, but should consider vulnerabilities to criminal infiltration that is more than merely whether it ticks the boxes and complies with legislation.
Well, as I can only comment on that with the audit reports that I was provided, that the AML-CTF program was appropriate.
Yes, and that's compliance with the legislative framework. But do you think, I'm talking about you, the individual, do you think it should do more?
I did not have an in-depth understanding, and I did not, how's it?
Sorry, Mr. Roberts, I'm trying to make it easy for you. No. I'm not asking whether you make any judgment about what took place in the past. I'm simply asking you about the current position. Now, we'll make it hypothetical, so it's not talking about Perth Casino, but a licensee of a casino. Knowing what you know about the vulnerability of casinos to risks of criminal infiltration, do you consider that a responsible licensee should do more than merely comply with the legislative framework for AML and CTF and see what else it can do to guard against risks of criminal infiltration?
Well, only on the basis that there has been infiltration. If it's doing its job, it's doing its job, and therefore, if it's doing its job, there would be no need to.
I see. So is the answer then no? If it's complying with AML CTF, in your mind, it's doing its job?
It's qualified in that regard.
Okay. ask you now to turn to question 32, is on page 10. And I think you may need to look at the previous page as well on question 31. Now, I just would like, if you can assist us, Commission, to gain a better understanding of the way in which the international commission business operated, or was operated, from the perspective of you as a director at the Perth Casino. In the financial reporting you received as a director, there was you would recall one of the items of consideration was international, or revenue from the international business.
Yes.
So you must have had an understanding there was a business unit of that kind
Yes.
that operated at the Perth Casino.
Yes.
To what extent, as a director of Burswood Limited, did you have oversight of that business operation?
I can't recall.
Do you recall having any oversight of it?
No, I don't.
Were there reports that you can recall that came to the board of Burswood Limited in connection with the international, how the international commission business would be operated?
I can't recall.
Is the reason you can't recall because it was actually undertaken as an activity in Melbourne?
I recall that Melbourne provided services to Burswood, and those services included an international business, and marketing, along with IT and hotel reservation, etc.
Okay, now do you recall whether there was ever any consideration at the level of the Burswood Limited board of the risks associated with the international commission business? And here I'm in particular thinking of junket operations.
Yes, there would have been.
Okay, there would have. Do you have a
Sorry,
recollection?
so I don't have a specific recollection. No.
But do you recall it having been a topic of consideration at the board level?
Yes.
And was it considered at the board level because junket operations come with a risk of criminal infiltration?
I can't recall.
To the best of your recollection, did the directors of Burswood Limited have any say in who would be approved to be a junket operator at the Perth Casino?
I can't recall.
Do you consider that, as a director of Burswood Limited, it was important for the Burswood Limited board to have oversight of who was approved for junket operators at the Perth Casino?
Yes, in terms of the compliance in regard to those matters, yes.
And in terms of the compliance, would you agree with this proposition, that there should have been probity checks undertaken by the executives or someone responsible in Perth before a person was approved to undertake junket operations in Perth?
Well, I can't comment on that.
Um, okay. On the topic of junkets, do you recall there being a change to the legislative framework in around 2010?
I can't recall. No.
Do you remember becoming aware that the regulations concerning junkets in 2010 were amended so there was no longer a requirement by the GWC to approve junket operators?
I don't recall that, no.
You don't recall whether or not a proposal on the part of the Burswood Group to make that change came for consideration before the Burswood Limited Board?
No, I can't.
You were asked some questions regarding some events that gained quite a degree of publicity that were that concerned Crown Resorts and in part the Perth Casino. You recall there's a question around the publication in 2014 of a Four Corners article,
Yes.
High Rollers, High Risk.
Yes.
You've said in your answer you don't recall having seen that program at the time, but would you agree with this proposition that as a director of Burswood Limited, it would be surprising if you were not aware of it at that time?
No, because I was in Europe at the time.
It would be surprising if it wasn't raised at a board meeting?
I can't recall that specific issue being raised. It was a long time ago, as you may appreciate.
Yeah, I do appreciate that. Now, I think you said earlier that Mr. Packer's a friend of yours, and obviously he came in for some consideration in that article. Did you have discussions with him about it?
No.
Do you recall whether in or during 2014 or following, at a meeting of any meeting of directors of Burswood Limited, there was discussion regarding consideration or review of junket operations in Perth?
Yes.
And what was the catalyst for the review or consideration of junket operations in Perth?
Was in respect of the arrests of Crown employees in China.
And what was your understanding of the reason for undertaking the review or consideration of junkets as a consequence of the arrest in China?
Based upon the briefings I was given in that regard as to why they were detained, that it was considered appropriate to stop junket operations post the arrest.
All junket operations or only those in connection with the Republic of China?
I can't recall.
Okay, so just so I understand, the catalyst for it was, is it your understanding the catalyst for the review was the fact that people within the Crown Group who were undertaking that part of the operation in China had been arrested and it was too high a risk to continue that part of the business in China?
No, the reason that... Firstly, can I qualify this by saying I assume that you mean by that part of the business being international...
Overseas operations.
Overseas operations. That it was seen to be... My recollection was that the welfare of the Crown employees was absolutely paramount, and it was we would not want to do anything that prejudiced the welfare of those employees.
Okay, but that wouldn't affect people coming on junkets from Indonesia or Malaysia or any other part of the world, would it?
I can't recall, as I said, that whether it was a carte blanche or simply it dealt with China.
So in any event, to the best of your recollection, any review of the junket operations was in connection with the China arrest. It wasn't for reasons in connection with the probity of those operators.
It's my recollection.
Now, you were asked, initially you answered it one way, and then I think you obviously remembered something afterwards. This is the question about the Wilkie
Yes.
allegations.
Yes.
And you recall there being obviously Mr Wilkie made allegations of tampering of machines in Melbourne, and you received a briefing from Mr Felsteed, and you were assured there was no tampering in respect of the operations in Perth. What was it that Mr Felsteed said to you at that time that satisfied you there was nothing more to investigate in Perth?
I can't recall the exact conversation, but I must have been satisfied that he gave me a appropriate briefing and assurances for me to be comfortable.
Now, given you recall there having been this issue of the China arrests, Mr Wilkie was making allegations in federal parliament, investigations had been taking place. Did it cross your mind at all in that period that it may have been necessary for the Burswood operations to take a closer look at the way in which the executive team were managing its operations?
Firstly, in regard to the Wilkie allegations, as I said, Mr Felstead gave me comfort that, and as I said, I don't recall the exact conversation and how I formed the view. He gave me appropriate comfort in that regard. However, this, as you appreciate, is a highly regulated business, and that certainly in regard to the EGMs, that the regulator, to me, it would be completely incomprehensible that the casino would tamper with their EGMs. So therefore, I saw no regard to further investigate that, and in respect of the China arrests, that the explanations that were given to me around the China arrests, I was very satisfied with in regard to why, and therefore again, as seen as two quite separate incidences, I felt comforted that appropriate explanation of both of those circumstances were given to me.
Okay, can I move to a different topic, Mr Roberts, and I want to ask you some questions about
Cheers.
harm minimisation, which you were asked in more direct terms in questions you received with your summons. I just want to direct you now to page 14 and questions 45 and 46. Earlier in the day, I asked you some questions about your views on responsibility for considering harm minimisation. In answer to this question dealing with problem gambling, you have said that based on advice of management and respective reports, your understanding was that problem gambling was relatively benign at, well, I guess at the Burswood Casino, Perth Casino.
Yes.
What is it specifically that led you to believe that it was benign? It was benign. What do you mean by benign?
Relatively benign.
Well, relatively benign. What is it?
What I meant is in terms of that on an overall percentage basis of people gambling at the facility, that there was only few that were affected or had any issues with problem gambling.
And so are you basing that on your knowledge of the number of people who passed through the casino in that period of time?
As I said, I took that from what was given to me in terms of the reports from the compliance officer in that regard.
And what did you understand the gathering of statistics to involve by the Burswood group? How did they collect their information? Is what I'm asking.
I don't know.
So do you have any understanding of when one identifies a small number, say, of people with problem gambling, how they were identified?
No, I don't.
I see. The specifics are not something that you can assist us with.
No.
So is it fair to say then that your view on this is based entirely on the information provided to you by the executive team of the Burswood Group?
That was my only source of information, correct.
And did you take any steps at all, or consider taking any steps at all, to test the veracity of the information that they were providing you?
Again, front of mind was the, at Burswood, was the frameworks behind preventing problem gambling, such as the responsible gambling framework, and because this was front of mind, and again with the support of having knowledge of the support from Crown, who had a much larger facility in Melbourne, and the relevant initiatives that we implemented in that regard, and there was a lot of discussion about responsible gambling initiatives and continuous improvement, that the problem I was satisfied that problem gambling was being appropriately addressed.
All right. I want to ask you some questions about this concept of problem gambling, just to see. And again, I'm not asking you to answer this as a director of Burswood
Yes.
Limited, or as you were then. I'm talking about your position now, knowing what you know now. There's a cause and effect aspect to problem gambling in that, I'll explain what I mean by that, in that if you don't offer the service, you won't cause problem gambling as an absolute. And if you design games, for example, that lead to an addiction or can lead to an addiction, then you're courting the danger of problem gambling. Would you accept that?
Not necessarily, no.
Would you accept then that when one is putting in place a responsible gambling or problem gambling program, what you are addressing are those that have got a problem. In other words, they've already been or have a problem associated with gambling. It's not preventative, in other words.
Yes.
So would you consider that a responsible casino licensee would consider not only how to deal with those that have been harmed, but to prevent some people from being harmed?
I'd like you to repeat the question so I'm very clear.
Well, would you accept that a responsible licensee of a casino not only would have in place a program to deal with people who have been harmed by the services they offer, but to consider whether the way in which they provide those services should be done to prevent harm occurring in the first place?
Well, that would depend if there was an appropriate framework in place, and would also, I'd need to understand, you know, what the effects were. I mean, it's very generalised in terms of your question. I'm trying to answer it, but it is.
And I understand it's general. I'm asking in a general way because I want to understand your view as a person who was a director of Burswood Limited for many years on what you consider to be the way in which a responsible licensee should behave. And the question is directed to whether a program involving responsible gambling should not only consider those who have been harmed, but consider how you offer services in a way that do not cause harm.
I can only go back and say that if the framework behind providing initiatives or a framework behind stopping people from having an addiction into gambling is adequate and it's been effective, then the answer would be no.
And it may be you're answering the question by saying if your program is properly tailored, it deals with the preventative as part of the program. Is that what? So for example,
no, I'm clear. I'm sorry if I haven't come across that way. I'm saying that if the framework is successful in dealing with problem gambling, then I would see it as being appropriate.
Okay, can I put it to you in a slightly different way to give it a more concrete example? Let's say you can design an EGM and the speed of play is 5 seconds.
Yes.
And at the speed of play of 5 seconds, people have to pause before they hit the button again in order to play another game. And there's a statistic that says if the speed of play is 5 seconds or greater, the chances of, this is a hypothetical,
yes,
chances of developing addiction to gambling are 1 in 100,000. So, just hypothetically. And then you design a game that has a speed of play of 3 seconds. And the statistic says that the probability of producing addiction to gambling is 1 in 10. What I'm suggesting to you is that a responsible casino operator would consider whether it should reduce the speed of play from 5 seconds to 3 seconds because it will reduce the number of people it sees in the end as problem gamblers. Would you accept that is something a responsible casino operator should do?
should give consideration
Consideration to, yes.
to not allowing the, to give consideration to ensuring that the spin rate is not less than 5 seconds.
Just the design of the game's full stop. Consider whether the design should be modified so as not to lead to problem gambling.
Well, hypothetically, in terms of the example that you've given, it would appear, if those were the facts, that consideration would need to be given to that.
So, in the context of a concrete example, you're agreeing with me that prevention is something that a responsible licensee should consider.
As I said before, that if the framework behind responsible gambling is in place and it is sufficient, then it is adequate.
Okay, so just so I understand your answer, are you suggesting, are you, that provided you have an adequate response to people who have been caused harm, that's sufficient as far as you're concerned?
Well, I do not know the exact details of the framework, but on the basis that if the number of people are affected and where that a framework is developed that produces that provides a very safe net of, as you say, it's a consequence of gambling is some addiction, and if that addiction can be minimised as much as possible and the framework behind that minimisation is appropriate, then it would be seen as appropriate.
Okay. A convenient time?
Yes, it would. And Mr. Roberts, we'll come back at 2 p.m.
Thank you.
Adjourn to 2 p.m.